Our first speaker is Jane Eccleston, who is the head of the Investment Managers and Superannuation team at ASIC, a role that she's also relatively new to. In fact, we started our new roles at the same time and we've been comparing notes. Jane, however, has a long career in senior management at ASIC, and before that she actually worked as a solicitor at my old law firm, which was then called Mallison Stephen Jakes. But since starting in her new role leading the superannuation team, AIST has really welcomed the approach that she has been bringing to that role. The first thing that she said to me when she started in her new role was, if you need to speak to me, pick up the phone. She might be regretting saying that now. She's had a few phone calls from me, but she's been very open and very engaged with the industry, and that's been great. The other thing that Jane did when she started in her new role was step back from a long and very divisive debate that industry had been having with each other and together with ASIC over 4 years in relation to how fees and costs should be disclosed to consumers. So what she did was appoint an expert reviewer from outside of ASIC to come in with a fresh set of eyes and review the law and the modifications that ASIC had made to it, and that was a great idea, and I learned a lot from the effectiveness of that. Which brings me to our second speaker, who is the expert reviewer himself. Darren McShane is with us today to talk about the review process and what he found, and make some policy observations about that. Darren is also an extremely experienced regulator who spent 15 years at the Hong Kong pensions regulator before taking a deep breath and diving into RG97. I don't know if he quite knew what he was getting himself into, but maybe he can reflect on that during his presentation. We don't have a lot of time for questions this session, but we will try to get to them, so you all know now how to send questions through the app, or alternatively stick up your hand. There are people here with microphones. I do have one caveat though, which is that while there's been a lot of discussion about the Royal Commission at this conference and elsewhere in this sector, particularly over the last few weeks, it would probably be unfair to ask either of these people, but particularly Jane, to provide commentary on the most recent round of Royal Commission hearings, which are still, very much live, as I'm sure you would understand. So with that, can you please welcome Jane Eccleston?
Thanks very much, Ailsa. And thank you to AIST for inviting me to speak today. So I really appreciate having the opportunity to talk to you about some of the current regulatory priorities at ASIC, which are particularly relevant to the investment operations of super trustees. So I thought it would be useful to really reflect on these priorities in the context of two main areas. The first being consumer value and needs, and the second one about stewardship and market integrity. I'm also going to briefly comment on ASIC's enhanced supervisory approach to superannuation. Before I get into the detail, I wanted to make a couple of comments about the environment in which super trustees are operating. So obviously earlier this year, the Productivity Commission issued their draft report, and it really highlighted the importance of super trustees striving to do the best by their members, particularly in relation to investment outcomes. The Royal Commission has highlighted the importance of community expectations, and that approaches aimed at minimal or technical compliance with the law has at times overridden fairness and good consumer outcomes, or worse, that misconduct that has occurred that has resulted in some very serious harm to consumers. So the Royal Commission's been mentioned a number of times at this conference. I've been here since yesterday, and I'm not going to provide a running commentary on it. But I did want to make just one comment, which is obviously there was more attention paid to the retail super side than the industry super side in the recent round. And in this context, I just want to remind everyone that for a super trustee, the measure of whether you're doing a good job is not whether my behaviour is better than another trustee, but am I doing the best for my members? Another relevant part of the environment is the power of super trustees as investors within Australia, as well as customers of the funds management industry. The role of super trustees in shaping the reputation and contributing to the stability of Australia's financial markets cannot be underestimated. In other words, expectations of super trustees are high. And this is right. This is rightly so. You are entrusted with other people's money in a world where consumers have no choice but to entrust their money to you. So let's focus first on consumer value and needs, on those people for whom we're here today, the many Australians with superannuation. So I want to talk briefly about fees and costs, but not just in terms of disclosure, but also some of the inputs that determine the value that consumers ultimately receive. Another important issue related to consumer value is ensuring that consumers that are engaged with their super get into the product that's right for them and that matches their expectations. So we've already mentioned Darren was appointed as an external expert to do a review of the regulatory framework about the disclosure of fees and costs as set out in RG 97. So the report of his review was released in July, and Darren's going to talk about it today. I'm simply going to talk about some of the background to this and some of the next steps. So we commissioned the review in November in response to some very strong industry feedback across all parts of the industry that there were some particular challenges with the implementation of the changes to the law which were made by an ASIC class order and described in RG 97. The primary objective of fees and cost disclosure is to assist consumers in making better and more informed decisions. Fees and costs are obviously not the only thing that consumers need to consider, and I want to acknowledge that point very clearly, but they are important. They're particularly important in the context of a long-term acquisition, and the impact that they can have on consumer outcomes can be very significant. So information on fees and costs needs to be relevant, reliable, and to the greatest extent possible, consistent with consumer expectations. So ASIC's in the process of considering the recommendations. I'm not going to give you a sort of, and we're going to do this, and we're not going to do that. So we're still sort of internally mulling them over. But I will say a couple of things. One is there will be some sort of change. And the other thing is that we're very keen to ensure that those changes are practical for industry to implement while providing transparency and usable information for consumers. Over the last 6 months, we have engaged with particular super trustees who have provided fees and cost disclosures that we thought were misleading and made them correct that behaviour. And we're going to continue to monitor this area while the response to the review is being formulated. As well, I'd really stress that while we're preparing our response, we expect all trustees to act in good faith, and we will act against deliberately misleading disclosures. So the next step from ASIC's perspective is that we're doing a consultation paper. We hope to release that before Christmas. And our intention is to release a consultation paper which contains quite a lot of detail. We think it's important to really have something that you can sort of practically engage with rather than just some high-level ideas, which I think Darren's report has very... in some ways, Darren's been the ideas man, and now we need to translate the ideas that we want to take forward into something more concrete for everyone. So if you're interested about the progress of this work, there is a section on our website where we are sort of trying to keep people up to date. So I'd encourage you to have a look at that. That's got a sort of overview of all the relevant material. So one of the positives I think that has come out of the focus on fees and costs work that ASIC and you've been engaged in over the past few years is really a better forensic understanding by everyone about what the costs are of investment choices. I know there have been some challenges in getting some of this data in a timely way, but it is really important that as super trustees, as custodians of other people's money, you understand the consequences of choices made. After all, members expect their money is invested carefully and decisions are made having regard to the value. Internationally, there's quite a lot happening in the funds management industry that's really raising questions of value and seeking to ensure that asset managers are acting in the best interests of the investors. I'm going to highlight in particular the MiFID II reforms. So there's no plan to introduce these reforms in Australia at this point, but they are interesting in that they attempt to translate some of the expectations, the principal expectations about asset managers acting in the best interests of investors into more concrete behaviours. So as I said, they're not part of Australian law, but we have seen some global funds managers change their practices. If you think about the areas that they're touching on, for instance, the principle that asset managers shouldn't incur costs unless the value for the fund has been identified. So things like the unbundling of brokerage research practices is potentially creating new norms about how this might apply in practice. Another general principle consistent with how we'd expect an asset manager to operate is to transact in a manner that delivers the best outcome for the fund. Best execution requirements emphasise this. So I suppose it's just a really interesting area to see how the funds management industry really changed their behaviour over time in response to these European reforms. I now want to take another perspective in relation to the value of super products. Is the consumer getting the right product? So this is particularly relevant as funds offer more and more investment choices. So one of the factors in really understanding this is whether the product is designed and distributed with the needs of the consumer in mind. The government reforms coming out of the Financial Systems Inquiry include a product design and distribution obligation, and also the introduction of a product intervention power. So it's proposed that the product design and distribution obligation will apply to super trustees as well as other product issuers. It applies at the stage of product design and distribution by, firstly, requiring processes and controls to consider the type of consumer whose financial needs would be addressed by acquiring the product, and also requiring a consideration of how marketing will ensure that the product reaches those for whom it is useful and appropriate. So I note that these reforms are not going to cover my super products. ASIC sees these reforms as significant. So while many in the financial services industry would already be adopting practices to take into account things like target markets and how to get a product to that target market, these reforms are really going to be a timely reminder to take a very disciplined approach to offerings and to make sure that what is offered meets the needs of those who are going to acquire it. Also in the context of reform, I'd also mention the government's SIFA proposal, which is obviously throwing up challenges in terms of product design. As new types of products emerge, ASIC will be keen to understand these and how they're being disclosed and marketed to consumers. I would note there's a cross-agency working group available involving ASIC, APRA, ATO and DSS, which can provide feedback on potential new retirement products. I just want to talk about one other factor in relation to whether the consumer has the right super product, and that's, can they understand it? Is it sufficiently transparent? Is it true to label? So recently, you'd all be aware of APRA's recent work on cash investment options, which highlighted that cash does not always mean cash, but might be used to refer to underlying investments which are very different from what you'd expect to be called cash, such as mortgage-backed securities. Offering investment options that mislead the consumer about the investment exposure is going to erode rather than promote trust. In June of this year, ASIC released a report about self-managed super, looking at the reasons why people go into self-managed super and their experiences. So one of the key reasons was that sense of control. It was understanding exactly what they had. So you can see that for consumers, it can be very powerful to feel that they can trust what is offered to them. In this context, I also wanted to mention some work that we're doing about products and services that people are using in the context of self-managed super. And that's particularly, around managed discretionary accounts and platforms. So we're going to do some work looking at market practices in this area to really identify issues affecting consumer outcomes, talking about things like transparency and conflicts. In relation to investment option transparency, I'd just note that portfolio holdings disclosure is currently on hold, but is not actually abandoned. At the moment, it's deferred by an ASIC instrument, pending revisions to the bill before the Senate. The last point I'd like to make is that the sort of transparency consumers need to judge to assess whether the product is right for them and offering the value that they're seeking continues to evolve. For some people, the investment option they want is not one based around traditional categories of cash or growth, but rather based around ESG preferences. Again, making sure the labelling is true rather than misleading is a way of creating trust in super. So next I'm going to talk about some stewardship and market integrity issues, and the sort of reference to ESG is a good segue. Obviously, there's a number of issues on ASIC's radar which are relevant to the role of super trustees as stewards. So I know that many of the superannuation funds take very seriously the long view of Australian companies. In a way, it is this investor voice that's been particularly powerful in changing disclosure about and consideration of issues relevant to long-term sustainability. So I just wanted to mention some of the work that ASIC's doing that might be of interest. First, climate change. So ASIC supports better consideration and disclosure of issues such as climate risk by Australian companies. Obviously, this is an increasingly important issue for the market. We've been undertaking some work to look at climate-related disclosure in the Australian market and hope to release something shortly on that. Of course, in some cases, the law requires that an operating and financial review for a listed entity does include disclosure about environmental or other sustainability risks, where those could really affect the achievement of the company's financial performance and outcomes, particularly taking into account the nature of its business and business strategy. The second thing I want to mention is we're initiating a corporate governance task force. So we're going to undertake some targeted reviews of large listed entities with the aim of identifying good and bad practices. Some of the issues we'll be looking at is our director and officer oversight, particularly in relation to non-financial risk and executive remuneration practices, focusing on the decisions by board remuneration committees to award and grant variable remuneration. We're likely to publish a report at the end of this project where we will highlight practices that require improvement, as well as those practices that represent good practice. So I think this might be of interest for two reasons. First, as big investors in many of these companies, it's obviously intelligence in terms of how they're tracking on sort of corporate governance areas. But also, I think it might also be useful to just reflect on how you compare. I think the expectations of corporate governance within large listed entities are high, and similarly, the sort of accountability expectations of super trustees are similarly very high. More broadly, ASIC's work in relation to market integrity issues will this year include a focus on the wholesale OTC sector, primarily fixed income, FX and commodities, so FIC, as well as equity derivatives. This is going to include work on the management of confidential client information and conflicts. For example, the disclosure of confidential client information, order management and trading practices. And also we're going to have a look at the practice of last look, where a liquidity provider isn't always bound by the last quote it's provided to traders. We're also conducting a review of the allocation practices in capital raising transactions, including conflicted business models. Allocations in keenly sought after transactions have a real value, which could potentially incentivise intermediaries to allocate securities in a way that might facilitate their own business or personal interests. So we're reviewing a selection of capital market transactions to understand better how allocations are functioning in practice and what sort of disclosure is provided. Our work here is ongoing and we're considering whether a regulatory response is warranted. We hope to publish our findings in this financial year. So in summary, we're continuing to focus on the integrity of the equity capital markets in Australia, but we'll also be looking at the operation of other markets that have traditionally received less scrutiny from ASIC. With superannuation so heavily invested across all of these markets, it's really part of the role that ASIC plays in ensuring that superannuation works well in Australia. So finally, before I hand over to Darren, I wanted to comment briefly on an enhanced supervisory approach by ASIC in relation to superannuation. Since I started leading the superannuation work at ASIC since last November, really quite a significant amount of my focus has been on strengthening the team. So in future, you might expect to see from ASIC more frequent on-site visits, more public actions in the superannuation sector, including more enforcement outcomes, and better use of the data that's currently available to ASIC and APRA, as well as seeking new data sources. So obviously one of the data sources that, if you've heard ASIC speak any time recently, we've probably talked about because we're all very excited, is the IDR data. So this is a consultation that we'll be doing after AFCA starts operations, and I expect that will be early next year. We're also going to increase the focus on the consumer perspective through the incorporation of more consumer testing and shadow shopping. And if you haven't noticed, the other thing that's happened on the consumer side is obviously the new Superannuation Consumers Centre is now going to be operating in this space. So I think that's something, a really positive part of the ecosystem in relation to super, someone who's actually funded to be the voice of the consumer. Well, of course, I've just mentioned the Consumer Centre, but also ASIC is not the only regulator in this space. ASIC, APRA and the ATO all have a common interest in this area. So you can expect our approach to continue to build on these already close working relationships. This common interest also means that there's obviously boundaries in terms of what ASIC does in relation to super. So some issues will be obviously within the remit of other regulators. Nevertheless, we plan to do everything within our powers to improve outcomes for consumers in relation to superannuation. Thank you.
I thought we might just pause here and I'll ask a couple of questions that have come through, which will be a nice segue to Darren's presentation. The first question was, you mentioned the importance of focusing on the value that members get. The question is value different to fees? And if so, how should it be measured and disclosed to members?
I think fees is an important part of that value, but it's not the only part. There's a number of different aspects, I think, to this value question. One is the consumer understanding, one is the role of disclosure, and the other aspect is the design of product, so it's actually meeting people's needs. So I'm not going to give a sort of essay about disclosure in a sense, but I think all of those things have a very important part to play in terms of value.
I guess a related question then is, why has ASIC chosen to focus so intently on fees and in such a granular way? The question is, shouldn't we be focusing more on net benefit?
Yeah, so I suppose one of the things that is certain in this life are fees. This is probably something that Darren can also comment on. This is something that regulators around the world focus on. One of the really interesting things in Darren's report, I think, is the comparison internationally. And I think we're getting to the point where ASIC has, in a way, been at the forefront of the sort of fee proposition, but other people are catching up. I think it's sort of here to stay. This sort of granularity is, to some extent, here to stay, though obviously taking some of the feedback from Darren's report, one of the things we need to think about is how granular to go. To what extent is the sort of cost-benefit analysis really serving the consumer well?
We might pause there. We've got some other great questions that we'll come back to, but since we're talking about fees, I might ask Darren to give us his presentation.
Thank you, Ailsa, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, thank you to the AIST team for the opportunity to talk to you this morning. I've been asked to give a bit of an edited highlights of the RG97 report. No time, nor I suspect interest to go through what's in the turgid 200 pages, so I won't make an attempt to go through all that, but I'll go through some of the highlights and then perhaps elevate my observations a little bit more to get away from the detail, which was such an obsession with so many people we spoke to during this process, and talk a little bit more about the underpinnings of what the policy and the regulations are trying to do here. Jane's already mentioned the report I did was commissioned by ASIC in November, published as ASIC's Report 581 on the 24th of July, and it's conveniently accessible, of course, on the ASIC website. In broad terms, there are 34 individual recommendations. As I said, I'm not going to attempt to go through them here and now, but they can be categorised in these groups. The first ones are things to make it easier for consumers to do this. It's about comparison. We can have the argument about what they should be looking at when doing comparison, but accepting the starting parameter that fees are an important part of that. How can we do that better? There's a group of recommendations about, well, working from paper-based PDSs just ain't the way to do it. It's just not possible for consumers to go and do that. So there has to be a technological solution to that at some point. But even within PDSs, they're really hard to read. I had the agony of coming in at this fairly fresh and looked at hundreds of your PDSs, and they're a nightmare to read, let alone to try to compare. And whilst there's some attempt to make them look similar, they don't look similar. They're very different. So there's a lot of work, some easy wins there that can be done to make that easier for consumers to pick up and have some understanding. And I also had a series of recommendations about the two particular tool sets that are in the PDSs, the fee templates and the fee example. There can be some improvements made to those to make them look closer, for that group of consumers that actually do the hard work to find them, which is hard enough in some cases. When they're incorporated by reference, I still couldn't find lots of them. And so there's some easy wins there to try to make the tool set work easier for consumers to do the thing they have to do in making this comparison. A bit broader, there's a series of recommendations about this highly toxic issue, about improving the relativity, the alignment of disclosure between different product types, between platforms and non-platforms. There are some recommendations there. I'm not suggesting that will make apples and oranges look like apples. They are different products, and so there are different ways that that's disclosed, but some of the recommendations I included there will remove some of the big differences in the way that looks and focusing on trying to produce single dollar figures for each option. And at the really techo end, and this is where a lot of the excited discussion was with some of you in this room and many others, on a lot of the technical issues, which I won't get into here, but I'm happy to take questions on later. Ultimately, and I think this was for many people, the real nub of it, without being specific recommendations, there's a methodology proposed which suggests ASIC could remove property operating costs, borrowing costs, implicit transaction costs out of the PDS disclosure, but keeping some of the other techo bits, explicit transaction costs, brokerage and things, and a new thing I've called counterparty spreads, which is the counterpart for explicit transaction costs. That's really the techo end, and probably this group isn't the group to discuss that. But there's a lot of reasoning and arguments in the report as to why I come to views on those particular issues. Scope for different opinions on those I accept completely, which is a segue into the thing I really want to talk about. Is what the heck is this trying to do? And there's a part in the report about the objectives that Jane touched on it. The objective of this fee disclosure stuff is not controversial. Yeah, the primary objective is to help consumers make the decisions they have to make. Comparison of fees is a relevant issue in certain decisions. I spent a few pages exhausting the argument, well, the different sort of factors are relevant in different sorts of decisions, and even different information about fees might be relevant in different decisions. The problem with the PDS is it's got one set of information about fees, so it sort of goes straight to the question, well, what even accepting all those premise, what's the type of fee information that people should be getting? And there's been iterative development of this in Australia and internationally over the years, which are helpful just to go back to try to keep some perspective about where this debate has gone and what we're trying to show technically. Sorry, I missed a few of my own recommendations there. There's a group about performance fees, try to make that easier, and also there's a group of ones on the softer end, which Jane has already touched on, about continued focus on supervision, enforcement, and education. But going back to the segue into this theoretical framework for what, well, it's all very well to say members should be given clear, comparable information about fees and costs, leaving aside for the moment, or parking for the moment, the argument about the relevance of fees and costs, but accepting that as a starting premise. So what sort of fees and cost information do people get? And this has changed dramatically over the last 20 years, not just here, but globally. Starting from a simple premise that, yeah, people have to be told the price of what they're buying. That's simple, that's obvious. And so we probably start off in a fairly simple place. In the overlapping Venn diagrams that I've drawn here, I start at this place. In some people's minds, even now, doing another presentation in recent weeks, a retail provider, a senior person in a large group had a go at me about the transaction cost. Well, we shouldn't have to disclose this because it's not a profit. It's not something that we profit from. And I said, well, it's been a long time since that's been the basis for fee disclosure, but even now, in some people's minds, this is about showing the profitability of people. I did say, well, if that was the basis for disclosure, then the industry funds mightn't have to disclose much, might they? So the discussion moved on from that fairly quickly, but it does illustrate the starting premise can be quite different. What information do we actually want to give consumers to show them this? I think in a broader sense, this really started off with the simple premise, well, we've got to tell the consumer how they're paying, and the fee is the payment. So this really started off about showing people what fee they pay. So what's the fee that's charged to a member is where this debate and discussion probably started. But as many of you would, so that has advantages. What a member is charged is certain, and it's reliable going forward because it's contracted. You make a promise about what fees you're going to charge. Obviously, this has some disadvantages because it doesn't actually reflect charging structures, at least not in Australia. Most of people in this room, and indeed most financial services, don't charge a direct fee to members. They don't get an invoice and send some money in like they do with other consumer products. So that quickly was a position that was, from a regulatory sense, not adequate, so people had to move to another broader group of possibilities. And the biggest and most obvious point is, well, it's not just the fee to the member, but it's other stuff that comes out of the fund, in effect. That's the same as the fee to the member, so we got to a larger circle fairly quickly. But this quickly gets down to highly technical discussions about definitions, and it's still the basis of disclosure in some places, but doesn't capture lots of things that are other defined terms that aren't fees: costs, expenses, levies, all sorts of things. So it's very gameable, and in certain jurisdictions there have been responses to that. And so that was never going to be the winning solution, it seems, in this game of measure and countermeasure, which regulators and the regulated community have been playing for many years. So the premise then went slightly wider, that, well, it's not just fees to a member or the fund, but fees and other things that are charged to the member and the fund. And so this then raises other definitional questions about what are those other things. Here, the language is based around costs. In Hong Kong, where I put in a rule set, and in the US, this is more based on expenses in an accounting sense. So there are different ways of doing this, but you can see the never-expanding arms race about what's included in this. But even that's not wide enough. In Australia, the language has gone beyond this because we know some of the cost impacts are not even charged to the fund. They can be charged to other vehicles, other places in the investment chain or consumption chain. And so you need an even wider circle to start to capture some of this stuff. So the language that and this was the constraint, I suppose, that I was working within and within which ASIC has to work, is the language around the legislation here talks about fees and costs affecting returns. Well, that's all very well. That's more embracive or inclusive, but it includes just about everything in a theoretical level. It includes the cost of the bloke driving the truck around the mine. That's a cost involved in that reduces returns of the BHP, which reduces the returns in the fund, or the sub-fund, which reduces the returns in the fund. So where you draw the line on those things then becomes a quite technical issue. There are also other sorts of costs, like in the transactional costs area is the really grating point of this. What sort of transactional costs get caught in this concept, what don't? Opportunity costs, are they the sort of costs that they reduce returns? Should we be doing analysis of that as well? The discussion very quickly crosses into the other issue that I know some of you are more interested in, the net return outcome. And so the narratives here cross over. So technically, Australia gets to this point, and there's a lot of irritation points around this larger circle. And there's a developmental policy narrative that gets us to this point, but I do wonder if it's now divorced from the narrative that the consumer understands. I suspect they're still several circles back. They wouldn't really appreciate where this goes. And there's an argument that, well, they don't need to know what's under the bonnet here, they just see a figure. But unless the consumers can relate to it, and it meets their expectations, there are lots of words about community expectations these days, unless it aligns with their expectations about what they're being told, then they're not going to engage with that information, they're not going to understand that information, and they could be quite grumpy at the end of the day if it doesn't tell the story they thought they were being told, whether properly or not. So that's just a bit of a historical background. The other issue about this, and this isn't in the report, is to the extent that this is now divorced from consumer expectations, there's always the risk that politicians will look for alternate solutions. What I noticed through this process was it's an area where no one's very happy. Industry's not happy. Ailsa was very unhappy at various points when I met her in this process, and many in the industry are very unhappy about something or other. They were unhappy about different things, but they were very unhappy. Consumers are apparently not happy. ASIC was not very happy, and even with the recommendations that I've made, I suspect we don't get to a point where everyone's honky-dory about this is the perfect place to be. And this is an area where there are other policy options. Politicians, governments can go other places. So to the extent you're unhappy with this, just be aware of the possibilities for other solutions on the fees and charges issue, because it is an issue internationally that will continue to grate, and certainly grate here. Now, I'll mention these only from my international references as to what other places have done to deal with this whole fees and charges issue. I'm not suggesting they're right or wrong. I just put them up because they are the sort of thing that, given the way the political and policy process works in Australia, someone could jump on at any point in time. So it's just illustrative of the range of other possibilities. So the premise at the moment is, yeah, we rely on market forces with fully informed consumers. If we move away from those parameters, there are other possibilities as to how you might do this. The most obvious is to move away from market forces and have market control mechanisms. Fee caps. As a policymaker, I've always been against them for very many reasons, but they're not uncommon, particularly in pension funds, and they're just some of the jurisdictions which do have them. UK imposed pension caps on default products, as did Hong Kong, and there are lots of other jurisdictions with fee control on pension products because of the social utility about pension products as opposed to retail investments. So that's not uncommon. The other thing is that at cost level, well, one of the costs is the cost of profitability by some of the providers. So in some countries, I suspect this is a sympathetic argument for this possibility, is that they move away from profit providers in parts of the pension sector. So using not-for-profit bodies or public bodies as the other alternative to remove the profit cost element from the chain. Similarly, there are plenty of examples where centralisation has been used as a mechanism for reducing systemic costs. Sweden's the poster boy or poster example for this in terms of administration. All the public pensions and the private pension element that's aligned with the public pensions are administered by a single body at a phenomenally low fee. Similarly, So it's possible on the administration side, and of course, even in Australia, there have been suggestions on the investment side, there could be some centralisation of investment processes to reduce the costs through that cost chain. And there are others which are perhaps less radical, but there are good examples. Part of the complexity here and the discussion and anxiety about fee charges, it is just so damn complex here. In other parts of the world, they do simplify this by simplifying the fee charging mechanisms. You're only allowed to charge certain types of fees. The golden examples are some of the Latin Americans like Chile, where you can only charge an amount once. On any pension contribution, there's one charge and that's up front, taken as a percentage of salary. That certainly focuses the consumer's mind when they're getting 2% taken out of their salary every month to go with their pension contribution. But there's no other fee or cost impact throughout the holding chain. So that's, and MySuper went a little bit down that road by simplifying the fee charging structures here. Another move, again, be anathema to Australia, is banning any marketing activities. Some countries have gone down this road because systemically it's a wasted cost. It's important as between you and you've got KPIs about market share and FUM, but systemically it's wasted cost. Moving money within doesn't increase the size of the pie, it's just money spent on moving people within the system. And that in some countries they've moved to actually ban the ability to advertise or move members in that way. And there are much more aggressive ways of allocating members or disclosure that could also be used. The Competition Commission report went into this allocation mechanism a bit, so that's a possibility that's well known. Aggressive disclosure in Mexico, your annual statement says every year this is how much is in your account, this is what you were charged, and do you know if you'd gone with this provider, you would have saved this many $100, and they always quote the lowest provider. So there are much more other ways of doing this that will more aggressively put this in front of the nose of the consumer. I'm not advocating any of those, I'm just putting those as examples on the table that to the extent that this remains an area of dissatisfaction and argument, there is scope for, in the way our political process works, for someone to come in with some clever ideas from the sidelines, which will remove your disclosure problems, but can create all sorts of other issues and parameters about the way forward. So happy to take questions on those general issues, or if you really want to go to the techo stuff in the report, I'm happy to try to answer some of that too. Thank you.
Into a phase in our political cycle where there'll be all kinds of, we'll be awash with clever ideas. So that's certainly a risk. We've only got time for a couple of questions. So I'll start with this one, which is addressed to you, Darren. It starts with a statement that you might have heard before from many in this sector, including many in this room. Fees and costs are important, but long-term net benefit is what matters most. How do we ensure that the regulatory regime doesn't incentivise cheap and nasty super products?
Hard to answer this one quickly, but one has to accept, both as a matter of political reality and of logic, that fees do matter. I know that net returns matter at the end of the day, but fees are a component of that. The problem is that the other component of it is even harder to describe and with any certainty. So the focus on fees has always been there for good reasons, and it has some relative advantages over the other part. What I do say in the report, though, is particularly given those expanding circles I referred to, that we've now come to a point where some of the stuff about fees looks very much like the stuff about returns anyway. We've sort of crossed over. So we do need a more continuous narrative to try to bring those points together. It should be looked at collectively because a lot of this, particularly the transaction stuff, can be better described in terms of the impact on performance. So if we can bring this into a single narrative, and this wasn't my brief, so I've got no answer on it, but some cleverer person may be able to produce a narrative that can bring those two threads together. But it's a pious hope to think that we can ever move away from a discussion about fees and charges, both practically, politically, and from a policy perspective.
And I might just finish with one last question, which is for you, Jane. There's more than 40,000 choice products and investment options on the market. Do you have a view about whether there are parts of the superannuation industry that deliberately make it difficult to compare products? And how are the proposed target market laws as part of the product design reforms going to work in an environment where there are 40,000 choice options?
So do I think that people are deliberately developing options to confuse people? I can't really say. I haven't done the work and I don't want to speculate. Do I think that there are some obvious problems for consumers in relation to those number of choice options? Yes, I do. All of the sort of behavioural economics research sort of talks about the fact that when people are overwhelmed with choice, they don't make good decisions. So that is something that I think is something which the superannuation industry as a whole needs to think about. In terms of product design and distribution, is it going to fix that problem? It's heading in the right direction. I don't know if it's a magic bullet, but I think the recognition that products need to be designed for people and for their real needs rather than simply what might look attractive in some sort of marketing spiel is something that I think is very important and is a game changer in terms of the potential if people can get their heads around that sort of concept rather than just what they can get people to take, which may or may not serve their interests well.
Thank you. Well, I might just close the session then, firstly by letting you know that your speaker gift is a donation to our partner, the First Nations Foundation, which is supported by Holding Redlick. Very grateful for that. Letting the audience know that lunch is now being served in the main foyer and asking you to thank both of our speakers.